they were seen once. At the base of the hill, clutching their rosaries, singing softly as the fog rolled in by morning. Their footprints led only halfway up the path. Beyond that, only silence. The church called it a tragedy. The locals called it an offering. The trees that border the hill stand crooked, their trunks blackened, as if something once burned here. Their branches don't sway, even when the wind moves. The grass at their roots grows in patches, dull and brittle, like the remnants of an old graveyard above it all. The fog is constant, thick, motionless. The locals said it never left, not at dusk, not even in daylight, and it was here that the 23 sisters chose to climb. They had come from a convent 3 towns over, their faces hidden beneath veils, their black habits weighed down by travel mud, their shoes worn from the last stretch of road. Their names were recorded in a ledger, but only one remains legible today. The ink on the rest has bled. As if soaked through, they came not to live here, not at first. They came to restore what stood at the top of that hill, a stone shrine, older than the town itself, said to mark the place where, centuries ago, angels had wept. But even then, the townspeople had warned them, not with anger, not even with superstition, with a quiet dread. The hill, they said, wasn't like the others, and the fog, it never moved at night. It only grew thicker. The sisters didn't arrive all at once. They came in pairs and trios, riding creaking carts that rattled over the cracked cobblestone road. They spoke little as they traveled, reciting prayers in hushed unison, the sound swallowed by the trees. Each time they passed through the town, the people would stop what they were doing. The baker would step out from behind his counter. The smith would lower his hammer mid-strike. Mothers pulled their children closer, not out of hostility, out of fearsome, whispered that the shrine wasn't meant to be touched, that the hill itself was a marker, not a monument, a warning, not a sanctuary. Others said nothing at all. They just watched the sisters disappear into the gray distance, the sound of their carts fading until nothing remained but the damp quiet. The hill had been sacred once, generations ago, before the town's first church was even built. Pilgrims would climb it barefoot, carrying candles in weathered glass jars. The shrine at its peak had been little more than an arch of white stone, carved with words no one now remembers. They said the stone marked the place where angels had descended during a famine, weeping over the dying fields below. Their tears, so the story went, had soaked into the soil, turning it fertile for decades. But over time, the soil turned dry again. The arch cracked and the fog came. The sisters ignored the warnings. They said the shrine's neglect was an insult to God, that the hill's silence was a call, not a curse. And so, one by one, they climbed, their voices drifting, like murmurs into the fog as they sang the same hymn. No one in the town could make out the words. They only heard the tune, a low, minor melody that lingered long after the last of them disappeared from view. But something wasn't right. It began with the animals. The carts that carried the sisters' tools, wood, cloth, and stone, would stop dead at the base of the hill. The oxen pulling them would dig their hooves into the dirt and refuse to move when struck. They wouldn't cry out. They would only stand there, shaking, their eyes locked on the fog ahead, as though something inside it was watching back. In the end, the sisters had to carry everything by hand, up the incline, through the mist, each load heavier than the last, and each time they returned to fetch more. The road behind them looked different. Trees, the rocks, even the soil itself, not drastically, but enough to notice. By the third evening, the townspeople could no longer see the hill's peak at all. The fog had thickened. It now bled down the slopes, curling into the fields like fingers, leaving droplets of cold moisture on every surface. It touched, and then, for the first time, they heard a sound faint, almost like singing. But it wasn't the hymn, it was something else here. A single voice, rising and falling, too soft to make out, but too clear to mistake for wind. Those who lived closest to the hills swore the sound continued until dawn. They kept their windows shuttered, their fires low by morning. The sound had stopped, but the fog remained. The sisters never came back to the town for supplies, not once. By the 5th day, Their carts, still at the base of the hill, were layered in a thin coat of dew. As if it had rained without clouds, their food sat untouched, their tools, stacked in careful piles, had begun to rust. Though no one had seen rain for weeks, one farmer, braver or perhaps more desperate than the rest, went to check on them. He climbed halfway before the fog swallowed him whole. He said the air was different there, heavy, like it carried weight, pressing against his chest and slowing his breath. The path underfoot grew slick, though no water was visible, and the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. Even his own footsteps sounded wrong, muffled, as though the ground itself didn't want the sound. When he reached a clearing, he saw something that stopped him cold. The shrine, or what was left of it. It wasn't white anymore. The stone, once pale as bone, had turned a dull, mottled gray. Veins of something darker like ash or soot ran down its sides around its base. The ground was wet, but not with rain. It looked like tears, thick, viscous, seeping from cracks in the earth. The sisters were there, two, all 23, kneeling in a wide circle, their heads bowed, their hands folded, their lips moved, but no sound came even from just a few paces away. The farmer couldn't hear their prayers, only the faint, low hum of something else, something deeper. He turned and left without a word. By nightfall, the fog had reached the first homes at the edge of town. People began leaving candles burning in their windows, whispering old prayers not heard in generations. Some packed what they could and left, following the old road away from the hillmost stake, but none would look toward the fog once darkness fell. And on the sixth night, when the wind finally stirred, it carried a sound. No one could explain it. Wasn't the hymn, it wasn't the hum, it was something sharper, like weeping, but not human. By dawn, the town's elders gathered. They spoke quietly, voices shaking, and agreed to send no one else up the hill. Not to deliver food, not to retrieve the sisters. The hill was theirs now, and whatever they had woken at its summit, it could stay there for. The fog had grown thicker. Still, it now rolled through the streets at night, pooling in corners, trailing along doorframes, as though searching for something. And at the very edge of it, if you stood perfectly still, listening, you could almost hear the faintest echo, not of prayer, not of song, but of something breathing. And the sisters? No one saw them again, not in the town, not on the road, not even in the fog. Only their hymn, faint and distant, drifting from somewhere far above, where the hill disappeared into gray. And each night, as the town slept fitfully, a single sound would rise with it, low, unsteady, and closer than the night before. A sound the townspeople came to know by one name, though none dared speak it aloud. The sound of something awake and listening. The valley lies still beneath the bruised sky. Low clouds drag over the hills, muting the last hints of daylight. The air smells of wet stone and pine. A stream cuts through the field below, its surface flat, unmoving, as though the current itself has gone still. And then the sound begins, a baloney toll, then another. The echoes roll down the valley like distant thunder, carrying farther than they should. Each strike is slow, deliberate, as though pulled from the hand of something not in a hurry. But there is no one to ring it. The chapel on the hill has been abandoned for decades, its roof half collapsed, its doors chained shut, its windows filled with boards so brittle they crumble at a touch. The bell tower leans to one side, the rope frayed and rotting. Yet the sound continues. That was when the townspeople saw Thema, line of figures, faint at first, emerging from the fog at the hill's crest. The 23 sisters, walking 2 by 2 each, carried a candle, tall, thin. The flames burned too steadily for the wind that swept the valley. As though protected by glass that wasn't there, their black habits trailed along the wet ground, soaking in streaks of mud and ash. Their veils hid their faces, but the faint glow of the candles caught the pale outlines of their cheeks and hands. Didn't look down at the road. They didn't look at each other. Their heads remained slightly tilted, as if listening to something above them, something no one else could hear at first. The onlookers thought it might be a vigile final blessing for the shrine, or perhaps an exodus. But then they heard the voices, not loud, not forceful, just steady, the sisters sang as they walked, the sound drifting between the tolls of the bell. Melody was unfamiliar low circular, almost as if the notes turned in on themselves. And the words, no one could place the language. Those who listened longest said the syllables felt familiar in their mouths, as though they had once known them long ago, but couldn't recall from where. Some swore the cadence matched old prayers whispered in childhood. Others insisted it was something older, something that never belonged to any church they knew. But all agreed on one thing: it didn't feel like worship. It felt like preparation. The procession moved slowly, winding down the slope toward the valley road. Each pair of sisters kept the same distance, their footsteps perfectly in sync. No one led, no one lagged behind at every 10th step. They would pause, their voices would fall silent, and the bell, though the tower itself stood lifeless on the hill, would toll once more, shaking the thin glass panes in the nearest homes. The pauses grew longer each time. By the 5th, their candles seemed dimmer, as though the fog itself was feeding on the light. By the 7th, the townspeople who had gathered along the valley's edge began stepping back, retreating behind fences and gates, murmuring prayers beneath their breath. By the 10th, no one remained outside. There was one witness who did not flee, a miller named Karen, whose house stood nearest to the road. He claimed he had seen the sisters pass by his window, close enough that the candlelight grazed his wall, close enough to hear their voices without the fog between them. He said the hymn wasn't just unfamiliar, it wasn't human, not in pitch, not in breath. Notes bent in ways no throat should manage. The rises came too slow, the falls too sharp. At one point, the voices split, some moved higher, others lower, until the harmony felt less like music and more like two different sounds stitched together, almost fighting to stay whole. Karen said his ears ached as they passed, not from volume, from something deeper, like the sound itself didn't belong in the air. But something wasn't right, because though he counted 23 shadows, only 21 faces caught the candlelight. The last two, he couldn't see them clearly. Their candles didn't burn, their veils hung lower, covering even their chins. And when the others paused every 10th step, these two never moved at all. They simply stood and turned their heads toward his house, toward him. The bell rang again, this time louder. The wood beams of his home trembled, dust fell from the rafters. His ears popped as though the air pressure had shifted, and then silence. The sisters had stopped in the road outside, all 23. Their voices ceased, their candles barely flickered for a full minute. They did not move, and though the fog hung thick around them, Karen swore it felt as though every one of them was staring directly at his window. He stepped back, his knees buckled against a chair. The sound of wood scraping the floor seemed to echo far louder than it should have, and that's when he heard it, not from outside, not from the road, but from above. The bell still ringing, though the tower by every account was empty. The sound didn't roll down the valley this time, it pressed inward, vibrating the walls of his home, rattling the plates in his cupboard, buzzing in the marrow of his bones. The sisters began to sing again, but this time without words, just a single low note, held far too long a note that grew heavier, thicker, until it felt less like sound and more like a weight pressing down on his chest. Karen collapsed. He woke the next morning on the floor, his ears ringing, his chest sore as if bruised. From within, the road outside was empty, no footprints, no wax strips from the candles, sign the sisters had ever passed at all, except for the door. The wooden beam had split clean down the center, as if struck from the inside, and from the bell tower on the hill, where no one had set foot for years, came the faintest, final echo, not of a toll, not of a hymn, but of something sliding back into silence. Waiting, the morning came cold, and without birdsong. Mist still clung to the fields, low and sluggish, as though reluctant to rise. The town's roofs shone with dew, each droplet catching the pale light, unmoving. Even the wind seemed muted, reduced to a thin, irregular breath passing through the empty streets. A group of men gathered near the edge of the valley road. They did not speak much, only nodded to one another, their faces lined, their boots slick from the wet grass. The air smelled faintly of iron Though no blood was in sight, they had come to see where the sisters had gone. The road was marked clearly, 23 sets of footprints. Pressed deep into the mud, each perfectly spaced, the prints were narrow, the toes pointing slightly inward, the heels sharp. The spacing between steps never varied, as though each sister had measured the distance before walking. There were no scuffs, no stumbles, no signs of weight shifting as they moved. It didn't look like a group of people walking. It looked like a patterned sequence pressed into the earth. With deliberate care, the men followed the trail up the hill at first. The slope was gentle, lined with dead grass and stones bleached by years of fog and frost. The path wound in a slow curve, always turning back toward the road, as if circling something unseen. The air grew heavier as they climbed, not colder, though their breath now showed in faint plumes. Just heavier, each inhalation felt full, as if the air carried weight, settling in their lungs. They didn't speak, not because they feared being overheard, but because their voices felt wrong. Hear any sound, even the scrape of boots, seemed to die too quickly, like the air itself was swallowing it whole halfway up. The trail changed at a bend in the path. The footprints split some, turned outward, veering into the tall, brittle grass that covered the hill's flank. The blades there stood stiff as wire, snapping when brushed, leaving faint marks behind. Others circled back, looping in a wide arc, crossing over the original trail before rejoining it farther ahead. The arcs were perfect, smooth, unbroken curves, as though traced by a compass. But 3 sets did something different. They broke away entirely, moving toward the edge of the path, where the ground dropped steeply. The prints ended at a cluster of rocks, the soil that was dark and loose, as if recently disturbed. Beyond that point, nothing. The slope continued, but no tracks followed it. One man later remembered only as Rule knelt to study the prints more closely. He pressed his fingers into the indentations. The soil was damp, soft, but firm beneath. The prints were deep, far deeper than the weight of a single person would make, and yet there was no slide, no drag even on the incline. Each footprint was perfectly clean, as if whatever made them had lifted straight up and set straight down. Without shifting its weight, he rose, glancing to where the 3 sets ended. The drop wasn't sheer, but it was steep. Below lay only mist and the faint glimmer of the stream, cutting through the valley. If anyone had fallen, their bodies would be visible from here, but the ground below was undisturbed. Farther up, the remaining prints tightened, drawing closer together, as though the sisters had begun walking side by side. The men counted again, 23, still 23. One set didn't match the others, was lighter, shallower, the distance between steps shorter, as though the one who left them was half the weight of the rest. It trailed at the edge of the group, never overlapping, always just beyond the outer lineal. Followed those prints with his eyes. Frowning, they curved outward again, away from the others, leading to a patch of bare earth where the grass thinned. The last print stopped there, not at a tree, not at a stone, just open ground, and then nothing, as if whoever made them had taken one more step, but into the air. The men stood around the spot, silent. The fog swirled faintly at their ankles, cool and damp, though the rest of the hill remained still. No birds called, no branches creaked, only the faint sound of water far below, flowing too slow to be heard. This clearly. One man leaned forward, peering over the edge. The slope here was not sheer, but slick, covered in moss and frost. No prints, no hand marks, no sign anyone had slid or fallen. It was as if the trail had simply ended. Suspicion crept in, not of spirits, not of curses, but of something wrong with the sisters themselves. No one walked like that, no one left marks like that, and no one disappeared without disturbing the ground. They continued upward, slower now, watching each print as though it might shift beneath their gaze. The curves and arcs grew tighter, the air heavier still. By the time they reached the final rise, where the shrine stones were just visible through the mist, their chests ached. The prints here overlapped, spiraling in a rough circle around the shrine. The soil inside the circle was different, darker, wet, though there had been no rain. Moisture seeped up through the cracks in the earth, leaving a faint glisten that reflected the pale morning light at the center. No footprints remained, just a patch of bare ground, perfectly smooth, as if brushed clean by an unseen hand. Raoul stepped closer. Air grew colder, not in a sudden chill, but in a way that felt deeper, sinking into his joints and fingers. His breath came shorter now. Misting in front of him, he crouched and placed his palm flat on the smooth earth. It was warm, not like sunlight, not like life, but warm, as though something beneath the ground had only just moved. Then that's when he heard Isa, sound not from the shrine, not from the trees, from the soil beneath his hand, faint, subtle, like a breath drawn slowly inward. And held, he staggered back. The others hadn't heard it, they only watched as Rule's face drained pale, his hands shaking as he wiped the dampness from his palm. The moisture clung, tacky, as though it wasn't water at all. The fog thickened then, curling closer to the shrine. It began to move against the wind, folding inward toward the circle of prints, settling low to the ground until the stones were no longer visible. One by one, the men stepped back, retreating down the slope, their boots sinking deeper than before, into the same tracks they had followed up. Rule lingered a moment longer, staring at the smooth patch where the trail had ended, listening for the sound again, but it was gone, replaced by something else. A faint echo, low, steady, like the toll of a bell, too far to place, yet close enough to feel in the bones. By the time they reached the valley road again, the tracks behind them had already begun to fade, not with time, not with wind, but with the fog, which now trailed down the path as if following, smoothing the earth, erasing every mark they had left behind. And as they turned to look back at the hill, only one sound remained, faint and steady, rising from somewhere deep within the mist. Not a hymn, not a bell, but a slow, rhythmic sound, like something walking but without feet, closer and closer, still until the hill itself seemed to breathe. And the men, silent, turned and walked away. Not one of them looked back again. The fog had not lifted by morning. It hung low over the valley, rolling in slow, deliberate swells, as if something beneath it stirred. The sky above was pale, without sun or shadow, casting the fields in a flat, colorless light. The air was cool, damp, and still. No birds crossed it, no sound carried far. That was the day the priest decided to climb the hill. He had been quiet through the days prior, watching the fog spread, watching the townspeople shutter their homes and light their windows at night. His name is recorded, but no longer spoken in the town. Only his role remains, the one who went up. He didn't go alone. 3 men followed him. One was a blacksmith, his hands broad and scarred. The second, a farmer, his face weathered by sun that hadn't shone in weeks. The third, younger than the rest, a mason with eyes that never left the ground. None of them spoke as they prepared. Lanterns were lit, flames sharp in the pale morning air. Ropes were tied to belts. The priest carried a small book, worn from years of use, the leather softened by his thumb when they stepped onto the path. The fog shifted, not away, not to clear it, folded around them, low and deliberate, as if taking their shapes into itself. At first, the climb was manageable. The path was slick, the stones damp, but their lanterns cut through the mist in narrow cones. The light reached just far enough to catch the curve of the path, the glint of wet grass, the pale trunks of trees lining the slope. But the higher they went, the thicker it grew. The fog didn't just blur the distance, it absorbed the light. Each lantern began to dim, not by flame, but by reach. The glow that had touched the trees only moments before now barely stretched to their knees. When the blacksmith raised his arm, the light on his sleeve seemed to sink into the air, fading into gray within a hand span. By the time they reached the first bend, the path itself was all they could see. Fog above was a ceiling, the fog below a floor. Their own breathing sounded foreign, hollowed, as if coming from someone else. The priest led. His steps were careful, deliberate, his eyes never lifting from the mud. He murmured prayers beneath his breath, but the sound didn't carry. Even those closest to him couldn't hear the words clearly. At one point, the mason asked him to speak louder. The priest didn't answer, only turned slightly, his face shadowed by the lantern, and continued upward. And that was when they heard Ida's sound. Not near, not far, somewhere between a single low toll it vibrated faintly beneath their feet, as though the ground itself had swallowed the sound and let it out again. The men froze. The lantern flames trembled, not from wind, but as if the air itself quivered. The toll came again, longer this time, deeper, not from the bell tower. Above, from somewhere lower, from somewhere closer. Mason whispered that they should turn back. The farmer nodded, but the priest kept walking, his pace unchanged, his eyes fixed on the gray ahead. He didn't tell them to follow, but they did. Each step grew heavier. The air pressed harder on their lungs. Their lanterns dimmed further, the glow now little more than a faint haze around there. Boots, the path widened near the midpoint, where the tracks from days before had split and circled, but there were no prints, now not of the sisters, not of the men. Fee soil was smooth, dark, as if freshly leveled by unseen hands. The blacksmith crouched to touch it. His fingertips came away damp, coated in something that clung like resiny. Wiped it on his trousers. Sound came again, not a toll, this Tamia note low drawn out, almost. Like a voice, the mason's lantern flickered and went out. The darkness around him was absolute. He lit it again, hands shaking, but the flame barely caught, burning small and dull, as if starved. That was when the fog moved, not with the wind, not with their steps. It shifted upward, curling around their legs, rising to their waist shapes formed in it. Not clear, not solid, just darker patches, moving slowly, circling the men as they stood frozen. The blacksmith raised his lantern, but the light bent oddly, as if the fog swallowed it in layers, and through the haze, something faint became visible. Lines, curves, like arcs pressed into the soil beneath the mist, forming a circle around where they stood. The priest closed his book. He didn't look back. He didn't speak. He only gestured forward, his hand shaking once, before steadying, and began to walk again. The others followed, not because they wanted to, but because standing still felt worse. The fog rose to their chests now. Their breaths came shallow, their lantern flames so dim they barely lit their own. Faces, the sound came again, a note, then another, then a pause, and then a whisper, not words, just a single breath, drawn close to the ear, though no one was near. Mason stumbled, his lantern fell, vanishing into the fog. The glow snuffed out before it touched the ground. Hours passed. The sky never changed. The fog never cleared. When the priest finally emerged from the hill, alone, the sun was already low behind the clouds. His cassock was soaked through, the black fabric clinging to his arms and legs, as though he had been walking through deep water. His hands were raw, streaked with something dark beneath the nails. His lips were cracked. His breath uneven. He said nothing to those who found him. Not that day. Not ever. They asked what happened to the others. He only lowered his head and wept, his shoulders shaking in silence. And when, later, the distant sound of the bell rolled down the valley once more, he fell to his knees and screamed, a sound so raw, so sudden, that it silenced the entire square. A sound no one could forget, because it wasn't grief, it wasn't fear, it was recognition, as if he had heard that sound before, too close, too long, and never wanted to hear it again. The summit was not as they remembered it, the last time anyone from the valley had climbed this far. Years before the sisters arrived, the top of the hill had been nothing more than the crumbled bones of a chapel. Its roof had caved in long ago. The stones were scattered, half swallowed by grass and moss. Only a weathered arch remained standing, its carvings illegible, its meaning forgotten. But now, none of that remained. The arch was gone, the stones gone. In their place stood something no one could explain, an altar, polished smooth black, stone that reflected the pale light of the fog like a mirror. Though no sun broke the clouds above, it looked new, untouched, and yet there were no marks from tools, no seams, no signs of how it had been cut or placed, as if it had simply peered around the altar. The ground was bare, no grass, no roots, just dark, compacted soil, damp enough to glisten in the thin light. The surface wasn't flat, it was pressed, shaped 23, Impressions each deep, each wide enough for a body kneeling, forehead lowered to the ground. The indentations curved slightly at the edges, as though whatever had pressed into the soil had stayed there for hours. Unmoving, no one had carved them. No one had dug them. The soil was compacted, hardened, as though weight had held it for longer than a single night. The prints didn't look recent, but they weren't old either, somewhere between, as if the ground hadn't decided yet whether to hold them or erase them. A group of villagers stood at the summit, their lanterns casting weak halos that barely reached the altar's base. The air here was different, still cold, but heavy. Every sound they made felt dulled, as though their words were swallowed before leaving their mouths. Even their breathing seemed quieter. One man, the miller, Karen, whose window had seen the sisters' procession, stepped closer to the altar. His boots sank slightly in the damp soil, his weight deepening one of the kneeling impressions as he moved. He crouched, extending a hand toward the black surface. His fingertips touched it and recoiled. It was warm, not with the heat of sun, not with the friction of touch, but warm, like a stone pulled from the hearth, or from something living. But something wasn't right. When his hand left the stone, the warmth lingered on his skin, faint but unmistakable. He rubbed his palm against his coat. The feeling didn't fade. The others, watching, hesitated one by one. Curiosity overcame fear. Each touched the altar, each felt the same unnatural heat, and each, when they pulled back, noticed the air around them seemed just a little denser. Their lanterns flickered, the fog shifted, curling low to the ground, sliding between the kneeling impressions like water, finding cracks. It began to gather at the altar's base, forming a faint ring, rising no higher than their knees. No one spoke for a time. The silence stretched, heavy and brittle. Only the faint drip of condensation from the surrounding trees marked the passing of seconds. Then, from somewhere beyond the fog, came a sound, a single note, low drawn out, not loud enough to echo, but deep enough to feel in the chest. The villagers turned toward it, their lanterns shifting, their hands gripping tighter around handles and strap. The sound came again, not from below, not from behind, from the altar itself. Wasn't a bell, not exactly. Was rounder, thicker, as though the stone itself carried the tone, vibrating faintly, releasing it in slow pulses that moved through the soil and into their legs. Karen stepped back, his boots sinking deeper into the impression. He stood over. He looked down. The soil beneath his feet had grown weight, a thin sheen of moisture now coated a kneeling prince, darkening the soil to near black. It wasn't rain, no clouds above had broken, and yet, drop by drop, the impressions filled until each one mirrored the pale sky like shallow pools. The mason, one of the younger men, crouched to touch the water. He never reached it. His fingers hovered inches from the surface when the tone sounded again, this time longer, deeper. The ripples in the pool stilled his breath, caught in his throat, and that's when he heard it, not aloud, not in his ears, but somewhere deeper, a whisper, faint as breath against the back of his skull. Not words, just a rhythm, slow, measured, as if counting. Mason staggered back, his lantern swinging. Its flame sputtered, then went out, swallowed by the fog before it touched the ground. The darkness that followed felt thicker, heavier, as though it carried weight. The other lanterns dimmed in turn, their light shrinking to faint halos, barely wider than a handspan in the shadows. The pools within the kneeling impressions began to ripple outward, as if something beneath the soil had shifted. The altar's tone came again, not a note this time, but a pattern. 3 slow pulses, a pause, then 2 more, each one vibrating faintly through the soil, into their knees, into their chests. The air felt tighter with each pulse, breath harder to draw. None of them spoke. None dared move closer. Karen glanced over his shoulder, toward the path down the hill. The fog had closed behind them. The trees below were gone, their outlines erased by a gray so dense it might as well have been stone. The tone sounded once more, deeper than before, and for the first time it seemed to echo faintly in the distance, as if answered by something far below the hill. The villagers turned back to the altar, The surface now reflected not just the fog, but their own lanterns dim. Distorted shapes, flickering as though underwater, each reflection pulsed faintly with the tone, warping with every vibration, and in that warped glow, faint shapes began to surface, not clear, not full, just the faint suggestion of figures kneeling. Head bowed 23. Mason dropped his lantern as the glass cracked, the flame died, and in the sudden dark, the tone stopped. No sound, no echo, only the weight of the fog pressing closer, the faint ripple of water in the kneeling impressions, and the lingering warmth of the stone beneath their feet. The villagers backed away in silence, their lanterns barely lit, their eyes fixed on the altar. As they moved, none of them spoke until they reached the first bend in the path. Even then, their voices came quiet, hoarse, as though the air on the summit had stolen something from their throats. When they finally looked back, the summit was gone, only fog remained, smooth and unbroken, hiding everything beneath it, and from somewhere far above, faint and thin, came a sound none of them had expected. Not a tone, not a whisper, but the faint echo of footsteps descending one by one, measured and slow. The fog never left that night. It rolled in thicker than before, settling low over the valley roads, swallowing fences and fields until the town below seemed to float in a sea of pale gray. The air was still, not cold, not warm, just still. No wind moved through the trees, no owls called. The quiet was so deep, even the faint creak of a shutter felt like a trespass. It was nearing midnight when the first sound broke. I'd a single toll, low, long. It came from the hill, but there was no bell there anymore. Old chapel had collapsed decades ago. Its bell had been taken down, melted, repurposed for something no one now remembered. And yet, the sound carried not sharp, like a tower chime, heavy, thick, as if the hill itself had released it. The toll rang again. Windows opened in the valley, one by one, their faint lamplight spilling into the fog. People leaned out, straining to hear. No one called to another. No one asked what it was, because they all knew, or thought they did. The sound rolled across the roofs and fields, settling into the ground like a weight. The fog seemed to thicken with each note, every particle vibrating faintly, visible even in the dark. And beneath the bell's resonance, something else began to sound softer. Lower. It wasn't a hum, it wasn't wind, it was voices at first. They were faint, just a thread beneath the toll, so low it might have been imagined. But as the bell faded, the voices grew clearer. They spoke in unison, even measured, each syllable drawn, deliberate, falling in rhythm with a slow, impossible heartbeat. No one could understand the words, not quite. They weren't in any language the valley still used. Some said it sounded like old prayers, the kind taught by priests 2 generations gone. Others swore the syllables didn't match anything human at all, but all agreed on one thing. Voices were not asking for help. They weren't seeking mercy. They were calling for another to join them inside. The homes, families gathered by windows and doors, their lamps dimmed. They didn't speak, they didn't move. The sound carried through the walls, soft but inescapable. It didn't echo, not in the way sound should. It slid through the wood, through the glass, as though the air itself wasn't needed to carry it one by one. People covered their ears. It didn't help. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt in the chest, in the stomach, in the teeth, a vibration, more than a sound, timed perfectly with the slow rhythm of the voices. And then the bell tolled again, louder, closer. Not from the hill, now from somewhere nearer. The houses trembled faintly with the force of it, window panes rattling, though no wind touched them. The sound lingered long after the strike, as if the valley itself had become hollow, amplifying the note. From within, a boy 8 years old, awake despite his parents' whispered warnings, pressed his face to the cold glass and looked toward the hill. He couldn't see the summit, only the fog, but he swore he saw something move within it. Not shapes, not people, the fog itself, curling downward in slow spirals, like smoke being drawn into unseen lungs. But something wasn't right. The voices had changed. They no longer moved together. Soft and measured they rose now, each one slightly apart, weaving around one another, like threads still unrecognizable as words. But the rhythm was different, not a prayer call. Each voice lifted, dropped, then waited, as though expecting an answer. The boy felt the window beneath his fingers vibrate with the pattern. His breath fogged the glass, and when he blinked, he thought he saw his own reflection shift. His lips moved, though he hadn't meant them to. He whispered something he didn't know, something in time with the voices. The bell struck again this time, 23 times each toll. Steady, unbroken. The first few felt distant, the vibrations mild, but as the count rose, the sound deepened, heavy enough to make the floorboards beneath the listening families creak and shiver. By the 23rd, the air felt wrong, dense, compressed breath. Came slow, the lamps flickered, their flames guttering despite the absence of wind, and then silence, no bell, no voices, only the faint hiss of fog slipping along the eaves of the houses. For a moment, it seemed over until they heard it, not from the hill, not from the valley, from above. A soft, collective exhale, like 23 chests releasing breath at once. Somewhere just beyond the rooftops, no one moved, no one spoke. The fog pressed closer to the windows, thick enough now that its surface reflected the dim lamplight like polished stone. For the first time, the people of the valley realized they could no longer see their own reflections in the glass only. The fog moving slowly, deliberately, as if searching. The boy's father pulled him away from the window, drawing the shutters closed with trembling hands. The moment the wood met, the sound came again, not the bell, not the voices. New sound, light, faint, like a fingertip brushing across the outside of the shutter. Then another and another, 23 times evenly, spaced, evenly timed, each one leaving the faintest hollow knock, like the tapping of a nail against wood. The family held still, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide in the dim glow of the dying lamp. The tapping stopped. The fog shifted once more, this time pulling away from the house, drifting back toward the hill in a long, thin stream. The valley grew quiet again, but no one opened their shutters. No one lit their lamps higher, because faintly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the fading sound of the retreating fog, the voices were still there, not calling anymore, whispering, as if they'd found someone and were leading them up the hill one step at a time. Convent was quiet when they found the belongings. The corridors, usually filled with the faint sounds of sandals against stone or the soft hum of prayers, had been still for weeks. Dust had settled in corners. The air was cold, unmoving, as though the building itself had stopped breathing when the sisters left. It was an early morning when the doors were opened again. The sun was pale, filtered through the fog that had now become a near-permanent presence around the grounds. 3 men, sent from the parish to collect what was left behind, walked the length of the hall. Their boots echoed sharply on the flagstone. Every door was closed, every room untouched. The air carried a faint scent, not of rot, not of neglect, something else, dry, metallic, almost like the faint tang of extinguished candles. And in each cell, they found the same thing: folded clothes, stacked neatly, rosaries, placed carefully on bedside tables and on each small wooden desk. A single sealed envelope, the wax was unmarked, no crest, no initials. The handwriting on the outside was plain, not ornate, not rushed. Each one bore no name, no recipient, just the seal. There were 23 of them, one for each sister who had walked. Into the fog the men gathered them, stacking them in a small wooden box, their gloves leaving faint impressions in the dust. When they lifted the last envelope, they noticed something beneath. The wood of the desk was lighter there, as though something heavy had rested on it for a long time, something circular. They couldn't tell what it was. The letters were brought to the parish, the seals unbroken for nearly a day. No one wanted to open them at first. The sisters had left of their own will. No one knew why. No one wanted to be the one to read their last words. But curiosity won. The parish archivist, a woman named Marin, who had known many of the sisters since they were children, volunteered. She lit a candle in the archive room, its glow casting long shadows against the shelves, and opened the first seal. Inside was a single line written in dark ink, on plain paper, in a hand she didn't recognize. We go to finish what we began before we were born. She read it twice, 3 times. Her fingers traced the line, searching for any indentation in the page, any sign of hesitation in the writing. There was none. The handwriting was precise, uniform. It wasn't the hand of any sister she knew. Marin reached for the second letter. Then the third. Each one bore the same line, the ink, the same shade, the script. Identical, as though every note had been written by the same person, or the same hand. But none of the sisters shared handwriting. Their records confirmed it. Each had written differently in the ledgers, in their journals, in the prayers they copied. These letters weren't theirs, but something wasn't right. The longer Marin read the line, the less certain she became about the words. They seemed to shift not on the page, but in her mind. The phrasing felt unnatural. Before we were born, not before they came to the convent, not before they took their vows. Before they existed. Marin pushed the papers aside, rubbing her temples, trying to shake the words from her thoughts. But the ink seemed to linger behind her eyes, as if the line had imprinted itself somewhere she couldn't scrub away. That night, she woke to a sound, the faint scrape of wood on wood, somewhere in the archive room below her quarters. She lit a candle and descended the stairs, each step creaking in the hollow dark. The flame flickered as she reached the bottom, though no draft touched it, and that's when she heard a faint, rhythmic whisper, not from the room, from the letters. She stepped closer, the candle's light catching the wooden box where the envelopes had been placed. Lid was open. The papers were no longer stacked. They were spread across the desk, each one unfolded, the identical lines staring up at her in 23 perfect rows. She leaned closer, heart pounding, the candle trembling in her grip. The whisper grew clearer. It wasn't the paper, it wasn't the ink, it was inside her head. The words she had read earlier were now repeating themselves, slow and steady, though her lips did not move. Each repetition seemed softer, fainter, until the sound almost vanished. And then came something else, not words, numbers counted backward. 23, 22, 21. Candle flickered violently. The flame bent toward the letters, as though pulled by a draft that wasn't there. Marin stumbled back, the whispering still pulsing faintly behind her temples, the numbers still ticking. Down, though, she had closed her ears with her hands. She left the archive room and barred the door behind her. The next morning, she told no one. The letters were sealed again, locked away in the parish vault. Those who passed the archive room that day swore they heard something through the door. Not whispers, not numbers, just a faint, dry sound like paper shifting, as if 23 pages had turned themselves over at once. And from that day on, Marin refused to enter the archives at night, not because of what she had read, not because of what she heard, because when she closed her eyes to sleep, she swore she could still see. The ink fresh wet, as if someone, somewhere, was still writing that same line over and over, and waiting for her to read it again. A decree came quietly. No ceremony, no bells, no prayers spoken aloud. A single notice, delivered by courier to the parish office, sealed with red wax. The crest of the diocese pressed deep into its surface. The handwriting was terse, the language stripped of reverence. The sisters, it said, were to be considered lost in an unfortunate accident. There would be no official inquiry, no funeral rites, and, most importantly, no pilgrimage to the hill where they had last been seen. The convent's records were boxed, the same day ledgers, journals, letters, even the small wooden crucifixes carved by the sisters during their final winter. Each item was bound, labeled, and sealed within the diocese archives, marked with a note, access restricted by order of His Grace. The parish clerks watched in silence as the boxes were carried away, their lids nailed shut. The echo of the hammer blows seemed louder than it should have, ringing through the convent halls as though the building itself resented the sound. By dusk, the place felt hollow, not empty hollow, like something had been stripped out of its walls, along with the sisters' names. Hill itself was declared off-limit. Signs were posted along the path. Private property trespass prohibited. But there was no fence, no guards at first. Only a single priest was sent each night to keep watch. his lantern flickering along the old trail until morning. The parish assumed it would be enough. It wasn't. First priest fled before dawn, leaving his lantern at the base of the hill. When asked why, he refused to speak. He only pressed his palms to his ears and shook his head, muttering something too softly to hear. The next night, another was sent. This one carried a rosary and a small iron bell, rung at every hour as he circled the hilltop. By morning, the bell was found at the base of the path, its handle cracked, the rosary beads scattered in the dirt like seeds. The priest himself did not return until midday. His cassock was torn, his lips were cracked and dry, as though he had been whispering for hours. When the parish deacon tried to question him, he only gave a single answer: "They know my name now." And he would not say another word, but something wasn't right. The priests who returned didn't speak the same way they had before. Their voices were slower, measured. Their words carried the faintest trace of something beneath them, a second rhythm, like the echo of another voice half a breath behind. It wasn't something anyone could prove, but those who lived in the valley swore they heard it late at night. When the fog rolled down from the hill and pressed against the shutters, they said they could make out the priests' voices drifting through it, not in prayer, not in Latin, just the sound of their names, spoken softly, repeated over and over. The diocese sent more men pairs, then trios, each tasked with holding vigil through the night. Each returned pale, exhausted, their lanterns burned to near nothing. None stayed longer than a single night. The reports, though written in formal language, told the same story. The fog was not silent. It moved, it curled, spoke not in words they understood, but in tones and whispers shaped just enough to mimic the edges of a name. Each man heard his own. Some claimed they also heard others. Names of men who hadn't yet been sent to the hill, whispered as though the fog already knew who would come next by the third week. The diocese stopped sending priests. They declared the hill spiritually unfit for pilgrimage and ordered the valley faithful to avoid it entirely. The signs along the path were torn down and replaced with heavier warnings, painted in red: "Do not ascend after Deus K." But the fog didn't care for warnings. It rolled down from the summit each night, finding the lowest points in the valley, seeping along the riverbanks, curling around barns and stables. Those who lived closest began hearing things, even without climbing the path. Sometimes faint knocks against their windows, spaced evenly, as though following a count. Other times, their own names carried softly through the cracks in their shutters. And that's when he heard it. Marin's brother, Elias, who had been tasked with repairing the parish roof one late evening, claimed he stayed too long by the eaves, listening. The fog was creeping along the road, not yet to the church, but near enough that the edge of it brushed against the cemetery fence. He said it didn't sound like one voice, not 223, each soft, each distinct, layered, so perfectly they almost became a single sound, and beneath it, faint but steady, the toll of a bell not distant. Close inside the fog itself, Elias didn't finish the roof that night. He climbed down, hands shaking, and left the tools where they lay by morning. When another laborer came to retrieve them, the tools were gone. Only faint impressions remained in the wood of the roof lines, so thin and deep they looked almost carved, following a pattern no one could identify. The diocese called it coincidence. The parish called it superstition. But those who had heard the whispers knew better. They began locking their shutters tighter, barred their doors, even in daylight, because the priests had stopped coming. The diocese had stopped acknowledging the hill, but the fog hadn't stopped whispering, and now it was learning new names one by one, in order as though making a list. The fog settles lower near the summit, now not drifting, not rolling as mist does, but pressing flat, as if weighed down by something beneath. On still days, it looks like a lid, smooth, unbroken, its edges curling just before they touch the tree line below. The path that climbs toward it is narrow, lined with moss-slick stones and leaning pines, their roots clutching at the soil, as if afraid to let go. Most who come this far stop at the halfway point, not because of the incline, not because of the warnings carved into the wooden markers, But because of the animals, the birds refuse to perch hear dogs balk, their legs locking stiff, their eyes wide and teeth bare. Though nothing moves in the trees, horses snort, pull back on their reins, their bodies trembling at something only they can feel. Even the insects seem scarce. The usual hum of gnats and flies strangely absent as the trail winds upward. The silence is heavy, each footstep feels louder than it should, each breath more noticeable, as if the air itself resents being drawn. Hikers who push farther speak of it in low voices. The feeling it starts just past the halfway mark, where the trees thin and the ground softens underfoot, not mud, not loose soil, just softer, like the earth has more give than it should, as if something beneath is not solid rock. Some describe it as walking on a drumhead. Others say it feels more like flesh. And then, as the fog begins to thicken, they notice the motion. The ground moves not much, just enough, a subtle, almost imperceptible lift, followed by the faintest settling timed almost perfectly. With the gusts of fog that sweep down from the summit, it isn't a tremor. The motion is too smooth, too deliberate, as if the hill itself is exhaling. No one can explain it. No one wants to. But every hiker who's felt it swears the same thing once you notice it. You can't unfeel it, but something wasn't right. The motion isn't random. Those who stand still long enough begin to realize there's a pattern, a rhythm. The rise lasts 3 seconds, the fall 5, a slow, steady cycle, repeating over and over, unbroken. Even when the air around them is dead calm, some try to match their breathing to it, as if to prove it's nothing more than wind and nerves. But after a few minutes, they find themselves struggling. The rhythm is wrong for human lungs, too slow to inhale comfortably, too long to exhale without strain. And still, the earth keeps rising and falling, as if indifferent to those standing above. Animals never reach this point. Even stray deer, accustomed to wandering high ridges, stop short and turn back, their ears twitching to sounds the hikers can't hear. Hikers claim they've seen birds, a few black, darting shapes, swoop near the summit, only to veer sharply away, their wings beating frantically as they dive back toward the valley. The absence of life is more than visual, it's auditory. Every sound, no matter how distant, feels dampened, as though the fog and soil swallow each vibration before it can echo back. Except for one at night, the hill hums, not always, not every night, only on certain ones. But when it does, the sound carries it, begins as a vibration felt through the soles of the feet, light, almost like the thrum of faraway machinery buried deep underground. Then it builds, not in volume, but in depth. The hum isn't high, it isn't even low. In the way thunder rolls, it's deeper than that. So deep, it feels as though it bypasses the ears entirely, settling directly into the chest cavity, the teeth, the bones. The sound forms a pattern, a long, continuous tone, followed by a pause, then another, slightly higher, layered beneath the first, then a third, each note distinct, but together forming something that feels less like music and more like a chant. There are no words, no syllables, just tones stacked in a way that no human throat could produce, too low, too resonant, and yet they rise and fall with precision, as if whatever is making the sound understands harmony in a way people never could. One hiker, a man who recorded the sound on his phone, played it back later in his cabin, miles from the hill. He said it didn't sound the same through the speakers. It lacked the weight, the depth. It was just a faint rumble, like wind against an old vent. But then he noticed something each time the tone rose. His windows fogged slightly from the inside, though the air was dry by the third note. The glass trembled, and that's when he heard a sound behind the tones, buried so deep it almost wasn't there. A voice, faint, drawn out, whispering something he couldn't make out until it said his name. He left the cabin that night, drove until the sun came up. When he returned days later, the windows were still fogged. The phone was gone, only his boots remained, set neatly by the door, their soles still coated with the soil from the halfway mark on the hill. He swore he'd never climb there again, but the hum didn't stop other hikers, braver or more foolish, still make the ascent. Still stand on that soft, breathing ground, still. Feel the rhythm beneath their feet, and each time the tones begin to rise, they all say the same thing. It doesn't sound like wind, doesn't sound like earth. It sounds like something below is awake listening and waiting for someone to breathe with. If the fence runs the length of the lower path now tall, iron, its bars painted black, the paint already beginning to chip where the fog gathers most heavily. Signs are nailed along its span, their edges warped from the damp. No trespassing danger area condemned. The gate stands in the center. It is locked, chained, and reinforced with a heavy iron plate bolted across the latch. The parish ordered it, the diocese approved it, but no one truly believes it will stop anything. Should anything wish to leave the hill on most nights, the gate stands silent. The fog curls lazily around the base of the fence, sliding through the gaps like smoke, its tendrils seeping into the trees below. The road that leads here is rarely traveled. Few come this close anymore, but on the cold nights, it changes. The air feels heavier before you even reach the path. Breath turns visible in the dark, not in short bursts, but in long, slow streams that seem to hang longer than they should. The fog clings tighter, as if reluctant to let anything move through it quickly. Locals warn that if you linger by the fence when the temperature drops low enough, you'll see them, not immediately, not all at once. At first, it's just movement within the mist, faint shadows that shift when the wind does. Not the trees beyond the gate look taller, darker, as if the fog thickens between their trunks to hide something standing still. And then the shapes take form. There are 23 of them, always 23 kneeling in perfect rows. The front line only a few yards beyond the gate, the rest stretching back into the denser fog where their outlines blur and fade. They do not sway, they do not breathe. Each figure is still, head bowed, the line of their backs forming a uniform curve, as though bent in prayer. The mist obscures their faces, their hands, their clothing. No one has ever seen a face clearly, but each figure is exactly the same height, their posture identical, as if they are not individuals at all, but echoes of a single shape repeated 23 times. Most who come this close leave within seconds. Figures do not move, they do not make a sound, and yet every person who has stood at the gate for more than a few moments swears they feel something, a pressure not physical, not a push or a pull, just the weight of attention, like being watched by something that doesn't blink, but something wasn't right. The figures aren't always facing away. Witnesses say that if you linger too long, one of them changes at first. It's subtle, a shift of the shoulders, the faintest tilt of the head, and then, slowly, one will rise, not fully, just enough to break the line of the kneeling forms. It doesn't turn all at once. The motion is deliberate, almost graceful, as though whatever is beneath the veil of mist is savoring the movement itself until, finally, its head is facing the gate, facing whoever is watching. And that's when he heard a young man named Rian, who had followed his older brother to the fence despite warnings, swore he heard his name spoken as the figure turned, not aloud, not in a voice, carried through the air, but behind his ears, inside his chest, a soundless, perfect recitation of his name. He froze, clutching the fence with both hands, his breath shallow, the metal cold against his palms. His brother pulled at his arm, whispered for him to leave, but Rian couldn't pass in that moment. The fog shifted, it opened a path, a thin corridor between the bars of mist, leading straight up the trail, winding toward the summit. The figures didn't move. The one that had turned stayed fixed, head tilted just enough that Rian couldn't tell if it had eyes or not beneath the shroud, but the path remained open, clear, waiting. He said he felt a pull, not like being dragged, not even like being beckoned, just a quiet certainty deep in his bones that something at the top of the hill already expected him, already counted him. His brother yanked him away, breaking the moment, and they ran without looking back, the fog closing silently behind them like water sealing over a dropped stone. When they reached the road, Rian vomited into the dirt, shaking so violently he could barely speak. He wouldn't return to the gate, wouldn't walk near the hill again. Even in daylight, but he told others the same thing before he left the valley for good. The path isn't there for everyone. It only opens when one of them turns to face you, and when it does, you have two choices: look away or keep watching until your name is spoken, because once you hear it, the fog will wait patient silent till you decide to step forward and follow. And those who do, no one sees again, not even at the gate, not even as shadows. In the mist just gone, count reduced by one until the next cold night, when the shapes number 23 once more. Some places do not forget, some vows do not end with death. The church's silence is a shield, not a resolution. And if you ever see the fog roll from the hill, do not count the shapes. One will always be waiting for you.